Indian Economic Development textbook for class 11. I've finished reading Indian Economy on the Eve of Independence. On to the second chapter, Indian Economy 1950 to 1990. And after studying the chapters, you'll know that the goals of India's 5-year plans, why planning was important after independence. So it all began the 5-year plans, and you will know about the development policies in different sectors such as agriculture and industry from 1950 to 1990 because 1991 we had the new economic policy. And then you'll also think about the merits and limitations of a regulated economy. So reading the introduction, on 15th August 1947, India woke to a new dawn of freedom. Finally, we were masters of our own destiny after some 200 years of British rule. The job of nation building was now in our own hands. The leaders of independent India had to decide, among other things, the type of economic system most suitable for our nation, a system which would promote the welfare of all rather than a few. There are different types of economic systems. So what are they? You have the capitalistic system, you have the socialistic system, and you have the mixed economy. And we did take up the mixed economy. And among them, socialism appealed to Jawaharlal Nehru the most. However, he was not in favor of the kind of socialism established in the former Soviet Union, where all the means of production, that is, all the factories and firms in the country were owned by the government. There was no private property. It is not possible in a democracy like India for the government to change the ownership pattern of land and other properties, its citizen, in the way that it was done in the former Soviet Union. Nehru and many other leaders and thinkers of the newly independent India sought an alternative to the extreme versions of capitalism and socialism. Basically, sympathizing with the socialist outlook, they found the answer in an economic system which, in their view, combined the best features of socialism without its drawbacks. In this view, India would be a socialist society with a strong public sector, but also with private property and democracy. So don't we make a do-it list, whatever, for the smooth day-to-day functioning, or we make a timetable? In the same manner, the government decided to plan for the economy, with the private sector being encouraged to be part of the planned effort. The Industrial Policy Resolution of 1948 and the directive principles of the Indian Constitution reflected this outlook. In 1950, the Planning Commission was set up with the Prime Minister as its chairperson, and thus the era of 5-year plans, or your 5-year plans, had begun. So what is a plan? A plan spells out how the resources of a nation should be put to its use. So in a way, plans are the timetable, as you would call them, to make the best use of the given resources, the scarce resources that you have. And we went on with the 5-year plans. Our plan documents not only specify the objectives to be attained in the 5 years of a plan, but also what is to be achieved over a period of 20 years. This long-term plan is called perspective plan. The 5-year plans are supposed to provide the basis for the perspective plan. Now, it'll be unrealistic to expect all the goals of a plan to be given equal importance in all the plans. In fact, the goals may actually be in conflict. For example, the goal of introducing modern technology may be in conflict with the goal of increasing employment if the technology reduces the need for labor. So the planners have to balance the goals, a very difficult job indeed. We find different goals being emphasized in different plans in India. Our 5-year plans do not spell out how much of each and every good and service is to be produced. This is neither possible nor necessary. It is enough if the plan is specific about the sectors where it plays a commanding role. For instance, power generation and irrigation, while leaving the rest to the market. Now let's talk about the goals of 5-year plans. Plans should have some clearly specified goals. The goals of the 5-year plans are growth, modernization, self-reliance, and equity. This does not mean that all the plans have given equal importance to all these goals. Due to limited resources, a choice has to be made in each plan about which of the goals is to be given primary importance. Nevertheless, the planners have to ensure that as far as possible, the policies of the plans do not contradict these 4 goals. Let us now learn about the goals of planning in some detail. Let's just talk about growth. It refers to increase in the country's capacity to produce the output of goods and services within the country. It implies either a larger stock of productive capital or a larger size of supporting services like transport and banking, or an increase in the efficiency of productive capital and services. A good indicator of economic growth, in the language of economics, is a steady increase in the GDP, gross domestic product. The GDP is the market value of all the goods and services produced in the country during a year. You can think of the GDP as a cake, and growth is the increase in the size of the cake. If the cake is larger, more people can enjoy. Right? It is necessary to produce more goods and services if the people of India are to enjoy, in the words of the first 5-year plan, a more rich and varied life. The GDP of a country is derived from the different sectors of the economy, namely the agricultural sector, the industrial sector, and the service sector. The contribution made by each of these sectors make up the structural composition of the economy. In some countries, growth in agriculture contributes more to the GDP growth, while in some countries, the growth in the service sector contributes more to the GDP growth. The second goal is modernization. To increase the production of goods and services, the producers have to adopt new technology. For example, a farmer can increase the output on the farm by using new seed varieties instead of using the old ones. Similarly, a factory can increase output by using a new type of machine. Adoption of new technology is called modernization. However, modernization does not refer only to the use of new technology, but also to changes in social outlook, such as the recognition that women should have the same rights as men. In a traditional society, women are supposed to remain at home while men work. A modern society makes use of the talents of women in the workplace, in banks, factories, schools, etc. And such a society, in most occasions, is also prosperous. So coming on to the third goal, self-reliance. So which was the first one that we did? Growth. Second was modernization. And now I'm going to read self-reliance. A nation can promote economic growth and modernization by using its own resources or by using resources imported from other nations. The first 7 5-year plans gave importance to self-reliance, which means avoiding imports of those goods which could be produced in India itself. This policy was considered a necessity in order to reduce our dependence on foreign countries, especially for food. It is understandable that people who were recently freed from foreign domination should give importance to self-reliance. Further, it was feared that dependence on imported food supplies, foreign technology, and foreign capital may make India's sovereignty vulnerable to foreign interference in our policies. So then we come to equity, the fourth goal, long-term goal. Now, growth, modernization, and self-reliance by themselves may not improve the kind of life which people are living. A country can have high growth, the most modern technology developed in the country itself, and have also most of its people living in poverty. It is important to ensure that the benefits of economic prosperity reach the poor sections as well, instead of being enjoyed only by the rich. So, in addition to growth, modernization, and self-reliance, equity is also important. Every Indian should be able to meet his or her basic needs such as food, a decent house, education, and health care, and inequality in the distribution of wealth should be reduced. Let us now see how the first 7 5-year plans covering the period 1950 to 1990 attempted to attain these 4 goals and the extent to which they succeeded in doing so with reference to agriculture, industry, and trade. You will study the policies and developmental issues taken up after 1991 in Chapter 3. So we'll start with the first one, agriculture. You've learnt in Chapter 1 that during the colonial rule there was neither growth nor equity in the agricultural sector. The policy makers of independent India had to address these issues, which they did through land reforms and promoting the use of HYV, that is high yielding variety seeds, which ushered in a revolution in Indian agriculture. Land reforms. At the time of independence, the land tenure system was characterized by intermediaries, that is, they were known as the zamindars, jagirdars, etc., who merely collected rent from the actual tillers of the soil without contributing towards improvements on the farm. The low productivity of the agricultural sector forced India to import food from the United States of America. Equity in agriculture called for land reforms, which primarily refer to change in the ownership of land holdings. Just a year after independence, steps were taken to abolish intermediaries and to make the tillers the owners of the land. The idea behind this move was that ownership of land would give incentives to the tillers to invest in making improvements, provided sufficient capital was made available to them. Land ceiling was another policy to promote equity in the agricultural sector. This means fixing the maximum size of land which could be owned by an individual. The purpose of land ceiling was to reduce the concentration of land ownership in a few hands. The abolition of intermediaries meant that about 200 lakh tenants came into direct contact with the government. They were thus freed from being exploited by the zamindars. The ownership conferred on tenants gave them the incentive to increase output, and this contributed to growth in agriculture. However, the goal of equity was not fully served by abolition of intermediaries. In some areas, the former zamindars continued to own large areas of land by making use of some loopholes in the legislation. There were cases where tenants were evicted and the landowners claimed to be self-cultivators, that is, the actual tillers, claiming ownership of land. Even when the tillers got ownership of land, the poorest of the agricultural laborers, such as the sharecroppers and landless laborers, did not benefit from land reforms. The land ceiling legislation also faced hurdles. The big landlords challenged the legislation and the courts, delaying its implementation. They used this delay to register their lands in the name of close relatives, thereby escaping from legislation. The legislation also had a lot of loopholes which were exploited by the big landlords to retain their land. Land reforms were successful in Kerala and West Bengal because these states had governments committed to the policy of land to the tiller. Unfortunately, the other states did not have the same level of commitment, and vast inequality in landholding continues to this day. The Green Revolution. At independence, about 75% of the country's population was dependent on agriculture. Productivity in the agricultural sector was very low because of the use of old technology and the absence of required infrastructure for the vast majority of farmers. India's agriculture vitally depends on the monsoon, and if the monsoon fell short, the farmers were in trouble unless they had access to irrigation facilities, which very few had. The stagnation in agriculture during the colonial rule was permanently broken by the Green Revolution. This refers to the large increase in production of food grains resulting from the use of HYV seeds, that is, high yielding variety seeds, especially for wheat and rice. The use of these seeds required the use of fertilizers and pesticide in the correct quantities as well as regular supply of water. The application of these inputs in correct proportions is vital. The farmers who could benefit from the HYV seeds required reliable irrigation facilities as well as the financial resources to purchase fertilizer and pesticide. As a result, in the first phase of the Green Revolution, approximately mid-1960s up to mid-1970s, the use of HYV seeds was restricted to the more affluent states such as Punjab, Andhra Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu. Further, the use of high-yielding variety seeds primarily benefited the wheat-growing regions only. In the second phase of the Green Revolution, that is mid-1970s to mid-1980s, the HYV technology spread to a larger number of states and benefited more variety of crops. The spread of Green Revolution technology enabled India to achieve self-sufficiency in food grains. We no longer had to be at the mercy of America or any other nation for meeting our nation's food requirements. Growth in agricultural output is important, but it is not enough. If a large proportion of this increase is consumed by the farmers themselves instead of being sold in the market, the higher output will not make much of a difference to the economy as a whole. If, on the other hand, a substantial amount of agricultural produce is sold in the market by the farmers, the higher output can make a difference to the economy. The proportion of agricultural produce which is sold in the market by the farmers is called marketed surplus. A good proportion of the rice and wheat produced during the Green Revolution that was available as marketed surplus was sold by the farmers in the market. As a result, the price of food grains declined relative to other items of consumption. The low-income groups who spend a large percentage of their income on food benefited from the decline in relative prices. The Green Revolution enabled the government to produce sufficient amount of food grains to build a stock which could be used in times of food shortage. While the nation had immensely benefited from the Green Revolution, the technology involved was not free from risk. One such risk was the possibility that it would increase the disparities between small and big farmers, since only the big farmers could afford the required inputs, thereby reaping most of the benefits of the Green Revolution. Moreover, the HYV crops were also more prone to attack by pests, and the small farmers who adopted this technology could lose everything in a pest attack. Fortunately, these fears did not come true because of the steps taken by the government. The government provided loans at a low rate of interest to small farmers and subsidized fertilizers so that small farmers could also have access to the needed inputs. Since the small farmers could obtain the required inputs, the output on small farms equaled the output on large farms in the course of time. As a result, the Green Revolution benefited the small as well as the rich farmers. The risk of the small farmers being ruined when pests attacked their crops was considerably reduced by the services rendered by the research institute established by the government. You should note that the Green Revolution would have favored the rich farmers only if the state did not play an extensive role in ensuring that the small farmers also gains from the new technology. So we have another subheading as a debate over subsidy. Now before I go on that, what do you mean by a subsidy? Well, it is a government incentive, a form of financial aid or support extended to an economic sector, say agriculture or industrial sector, with the aim of promoting economic and social policy to better their conditions, that is. So there was this debate over subsidies. The economic justification of subsidies in agriculture is at present a hotly debated question. It is generally agreed that it was necessary to use subsidies to provide an incentive for adoption of the new HYV technology by farmers in general and small farmers in particular. Any new technology will be looked upon as being risky by farmers. Subsidies were therefore needed to encourage farmers to test the new technology. Some economists believe that once the technology is found profitable and is widely adopted, then subsidies could be phased out. So, subsidies then should be phased out since their purpose has been served. Further, subsidies are meant to benefit the farmers, but a substantial amount of fertilizer subsidy also benefits the fertilizer industry. And among farmers, the subsidy largely benefits the farmers in the most prosperous regions. Therefore, it is argued that there is no cause for continuing with fertilizer subsidies. It does not benefit the target group, and it is a huge burden on the government's finances. On the other hand, some believe that the government should continue with agricultural subsidies because farming in India continues to be a risky business. Most farmers are very poor and they will not be able to afford the required inputs without subsidies. Eliminating subsidies will increase the inequality between rich and poor farmers and violate the goal of equity. These experts argue that if subsidies are largely benefiting the fertilizer industry and big farmers, the correct policy is not to abolish subsidies but to take steps to ensure that only the poor farmers enjoy the benefits. Thus, by the late 1960s, Indian agricultural productivity had increased sufficiently to enable the country to be self-sufficient in food grains. This is an achievement to be proud of. On the negative side, some 65% of the country's population continued to be employed in agriculture even as late as 1990. Economists have found that as a nation becomes more prosperous, the proportion of GDP contributed by agriculture as well as proportion of population working in the sector declines considerably. In India, between 1950 and 1990, the proportion of GDP contributed by agriculture declined significantly, but not the population depending on it. 67.5% in 1950 to 64.9% by 1990. Why was such a large proportion of population engaged in agriculture, although agricultural output could have grown with much less people working in the sector? The answer is that the industrial sector and the service sector did not absorb the people working in the agriculture sector. Many economists call this an important failure of our policies followed during 1950 to 1990. Another subpoint in Indian economy 1950 to 1990 is industry and trade. Economists have found that poor nations can progress only if they have a good industrial sector. Industry provides employment which is more stable than the employment in agriculture. It promotes modernization and overall prosperity. It is for this reason that the 5-year plans place a lot of emphasis on industrial development. You might have studied in the previous chapter that at the time of independence, the variety of industries was very narrow. It was largely confined to cotton, textile and jute. There were 2 well-managed iron and steel firms, one in Jamshedpur and the other in Kolkata. But obviously, we needed to expand the industrial base with a variety of industries if the economy was to grow. So another subpoint is public and private sectors in Indian industrial development. The big question facing the policymakers was, what should be the role of the government and the private sector in industrial development? At the time of independence, Indian industrialists did not have the capital to undertake investment in industrial ventures required for the development of our economy, nor was the market big enough to encourage the industrialists to undertake major projects even if they had the capital to do so. It is principally for these reasons that the state had to play an extensive role in promoting the industrial sector. In addition, the decision to develop the Indian economy on socialist lines led to the policy of state controlling the commanding heights of the economy, as the second 5-year plan put it. This meant that the state would have complete control of those industries that were vital for the economy. The policies of the private sector would have to be complementary to those of the public sector with the public sector leading the way. So we have the Industrial Policy Resolution 1956. In accordance with the goal of the state controlling the commanding heights of the economy, the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956 was adopted. This resolution formed the basis of the second five-year plan, the plan which tried to build the basis for a socialist pattern of society. This resolution classified industries into three categories. The first category comprised industries which would be exclusively owned by the state. The second category consisted of industries in which the private sector could supplement the efforts of the state sector, with the state taking the sole responsibility for starting new units. The third category consisted of the remaining industries which were to be in the private sector. Although there was a category of industries left to the private sector, the sector was kept under state control through a system of licenses. No new industry was allowed unless a license was obtained from the government. This policy was used for promoting industry in the backward region. It was easier to obtain a license if the industrial unit was established in the economically backward area. In addition, such units were given certain concessions such as tax benefits and electricity at lower tariff. The purpose of this policy was to promote regional equality. Even an existing industry had to obtain a license for expanding output or for diversifying production, that is, producing a new variety of good. This was meant to ensure that the quantity of goods produced was not more than what the economy required. License to expand production was given only if the government was convinced that the economy required a large quantity of goods. Small-scale industry. In 1955, the Village and Small-Scale Industries Committee, also called the Karvi Committee, noted the possibility of using small-scale industries for promoting rural development. A small-scale industry is defined with reference to the maximum investment allowed on the assets of a unit. This limit has changed over a period of time. In 1950, a small-scale industrial unit was one which invested a maximum of rupees 5 lakhs. At present, the maximum investment allowed is rupees 1 crores. It is believed that small-scale industries are more labor-intensive, that is, they use more labor than the large-scale industries and therefore generate more employment, but these industries cannot compete with the big industrial firms. It is obvious that the development of small-scale industry requires them to be shielded from the large firms. For this purpose, the production of a number of products was reserved for the small-scale industry. The